Welcome, this is Craig. I'm going to talk a little bit about brushes today in Photoshop, and we'll start by, our goal will be to create kind of this tail for an animal that has a fur-like quality in it, and it has some brush strokes in it, and it also has some depth and perspective. Now, there really isn't a lot of magic when working with Photoshop brushes. Most of the magic comes from, or I should say 99% of all the magic comes from being able to draw and see the difference between shadows, midtones, and highlights, and how that makes your subject matter come to life by adding depth and contrast to it. So, with that started, what I've done, or with that, let's start. I have come up with 6 colors here in a palette. I like to do this first so I have them sampled and ready to go. As a painter, I like to have a palette ready with paints that are already mixed so that you can just start to draw from them and you know what the end colors will look like first. So having created this palette, and if you want to use this palette, you can certainly just do a screenshot of this and sample these colors. So first, let's start by making a brush. And in Photoshop, I'm going to switch to black and white here. And to make kind of a random brush, I'm on my brush tool, which is the simple hard round brush. And we're going to make something that's just kind of random. Oops, I want my opacity all the way up to 100. And in my brush, I'm also going to set my shape dynamics. I have a Wacom tablet, so I'm going to set this to pen pressure under shape dynamics. All that does is when I press, if I press lightly, I get a small dot. If I press harder, I get a larger dot. So we're going to make just kind of a random pattern. Make some of these a little bit larger, some a little smaller. And that's probably good right there. So now I'll switch to my marquee tool and I will select this. I did this on the color layer. It doesn't really matter what layer you do it on because we'll delete it afterward. So I selected this, and by the way, if you look at this, this is about an inch, about 2 inches across. And what you set initially will be how large or how small you can set your brush. So now that I have this area selected, I'll go under Edit to define Brush Preset. And that will basically say we'll make a new brush out of this. It's picked up that the brush itself, the black dots, are 705 pixels across. That's a pretty good size brush. I'll probably work with it almost always smaller than that. But I am simply going to just name this Fur Brush. Type Return. And you will notice if I type my B now, actually let me just delete this part. Command D to get rid of my selections, type B to go to my brush. It has placed that at the very end of my list of brushes under Fur. So if your brush palette doesn't look like this, I simply have large lists selected. You may come in and see it looking like this, small thumbnail. Just for demonstration purposes, I have chosen large list so we can see what it looks like and which brush is chosen. So here is my Fur brush, and now I'm going to reduce this a little bit. And now my brush is here. So you can see I'm going to make sure that I have the pressure set up under Shape Dynamics to pen pressure. And I'll turn smoothing on as well. You can play around with this, or we can play around with this a little bit later. Let's just do some basic stuff right now. So I'm going to bump this up a little bit in size, and we'll do a couple of swipes. Now you'll notice that as I press lightly, I get a very, very thin, and then as I press harder, it gets thicker. So this allows me to press real hard all the way across. It gives me this jitter like that. So what I want to do is I want to reduce my opacity first. And I'm going to drop it to just 50%. It seems like a good starting point. And now you'll see, I'm going to create a new layer here. And as I go over these, they darken each other. And as they overlap, they get a little bit darker and a little bit darker. And this gives me kind of a nice hair look to it, or a fur look here. So we'll clear this layer. Now on this layer, I usually like to start when I paint with a middle tone. Now it always depends on what you're painting, but digitally you can start with your dark tone, your light tone, whatever you want. As a painter, I typically would start with my middle tones and then I'd add a little bit of darker, say acrylic to it, or then I'd add a little bit of lighter. So my thought is I'll just start with what I know, but I also know that I've started with complete black in digital drawings, and you can paint up over it and build up through your midtones and through your highlights. So while I'm in while I'm in my brush, I simply hold down my Option key, and I can click on one of these and sample it, and that will put that color into my foreground color. And now what I'll do is I'm going to drop my brush just a little bit, and I will start to lay out the shape of this. Let's do some light sketching here. Kind of show what this will look like. And now I'll fill this in. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. Zoom in, and I'm building up these middle tones. I'm okay if they overlap. They don't have to be perfect because we're going to cover a lot of this as we go through. By the way, you can't just press down and keep going over like this without lifting up your pen, because it will simply fill it in and there won't be any overlap of that 50% opacity. What you have to do is you have to go over it several times and let up on the pen pressure, and then it will build up your layers. Okay, so once we have that about where our middle tone needs to be, let me zoom over here, back out just a little bit. I'm going to bring this out just a little bit more, make it just a little bit thicker. Now I'll switch to my darker one. So I hold my Option key down, and actually I'll switch to just one darker, and I will slowly build this up a little bit too. I'm still on 50% opacity, but now what I'm doing is I'm building up one side where I know my shadows will be. I'll pretend that my light source is coming from this direction so that I know that this underside of the tail I want to be darker. So I'm going to still bring some of this up in to the lighter portion, or the middle tones, because that also needs to be a little bit dark in some areas. And this will give it depth and dimension. Not too much though, but we want some in there. Trying to keep it looking as even as possible. And now I'll start to pull some of these and reduce my brush just a little bit. I'm going to start to build up some of the layers in here. Okay, let's switch now. Hold my Option key down, switch over to the darkest of these, and I'll start to put in some of the final shadows. Trying to make little tufts of hair in here. Dragging this with my pen tool, pressing in the beginning lightly, a little bit thicker in the end, or in the middle, and letting up in the end. So I get that thin, thick, thin feel to it. Okay, I'm going to pull some of the super dark into here, so we have just a little bit in here. If we zoom in, you can see I'm getting that brush stroke that makes it look like hair. But most illustrations are viewed kind of holistically from a distance. All right, now I'm going to switch to this lighter one, and I'm going to start to build the middle tones in the middle here. I'll add those in the middle, bring them up a little bit into the highlight area, a little bit down here, and just a little bit, a few of them, as they come around the back side of the tail where it's really dark. Switch to the even lighter color. Now I'm going to start to fill in this top part where I want it to be really light. Again, allowing some of the really, really dark and the middle tones to show through. That's what builds up the texture. But I will put more of this here up on the top and on the side, because that's where it's going to be lighter, since my light direction is coming from the upper left there. I'll bring some along in here. Come down here, fill in this with this light. I have like one light color left, so I'm kind of balancing that out, knowing I'm still going to put a little bit more or something even lighter on the tail. So now as I zoom out, I start to see that this is forming a three-dimensional shape. Now I'm going to select my lightest color, and the bottom here is almost all this color. So I'm going to make kind of this little diamond shape here, rhombus shape, and pull that in so that gets just a little bit lighter, all the way down to the very end here. And now I'll start to bring up the super, super light part. And I like this to look a little bit stylized so you can see the brush strokes. I like that you can see that a human hand using a computer drew this. So I'll pull some of the lights in here. Blend that in just a little bit. Now, looking at this, I want to add a little more detail in here. I like this one, how it's a little bit coarser. So I'll go back to my maybe second to the last dark, and I'll start to pull some of this back in here, just to give this a little more texture. I think I'll bump up my opacity just a little bit. We'll go maybe to 70. And that will allow me to put a little bit of this darker over top of everything, not breaking it up too much, but this will just give it a little more depth and a little more contrast where I feel I've lost some of that up here. I'm going to go to my super dark now, and I'm really going to, my super dark, and I really want to put some of that here to give it more depth. I feel like it wasn't quite as dark as I wanted it to be in here. All right, so continuing to move through here, darken it. Now, in here, I want to add just a little bit of this lighter, just a little bit down here, because this should still have some shadows to it. It'll just be a little bit lighter. And in here, darken this just a little bit too. Just a little bit darker. So I have shadows, highlights, and midtones. Now as I zoom out, you can see this one looks a little bit more scattered. This one a little bit, the strokes were a little bit longer. Just wanted to show you two different types. This one could probably still be a little bit darker over here. And if I just make longer strokes, it'll make it look more like this. But I think either one works pretty well. And this down here could just use a little bit more shadow in here. So just the beginning of how to create a brush in Photoshop and how to use these 6 colors to build up colors here to create something that's a little bit three-dimensional and something that looks like it kind of pops off the page. I hope that helps. Thank you. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please go to my YouTube channel and subscribe. And if you'd like to see more tutorials here, I also have a lot of tutorials over on craigkuntz.com. So go there and check out tutorials on graphic design, woodworking, and web design. Thank you.